One of my favorite quotations of the 19th century is that of Ludwig van Beethoven, the composer. Dun, 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 dun. Ludwig van Beethoven, the composer, one time said, "I would like to grab fate by the throat." When we talk about all these Europeans coming from farms, all these so-called American buckwheats, is what we call farmers who moved to the city in the late 19th century, buckwheats. As we talk about this tremendous flux and transformation and change, this encounter with cities and with new kind of jobs, specialization of labor, farmers, we can see how people were finding themselves out of control. They no longer could control their fate. And we find a lot of anger kind of surging up as in the Ludwig Beethoven quote, "I would like to grab fate by the throat." Today, when we talk about the blue-collar class, and we mean by that the group that's pretty much using their own energy rather than mental energy for their jobs, we're talking about all these immigrants to the big cities working in highly specialized labor areas. We're going to talk about their defeat, about how they were really not able to grab fate by the throat, the defeat of labor, and I'll basically try to argue that the working class is just way too lacking in unity to really mount an effective counter-thrust to the corporates, capitalists, and the way in which business became structured in the 19th century. We have too many foreign speakers among these workers, too many different groups of people, too many different ideas about the working class could do. If the working class had united in our democratic society, they should have won. But instead, as a class, they lose. Twice as many children workers at the end of the century than there were before. Wages do not increase. Hours do not get better in the late 19th century. And of course, what are we talking about when we're talking about blue-collar people working in factories at this time? Pretty much 12-hour days, 6 days a week. Things are not real nice. So we can imagine, maybe you're a European foreign speaker. And also, since we're not going to devote a kind of special chapter to this, where are these immigrants coming from pretty much in the late 19th century? We get a huge group, for instance, that has about 7 million, and that the Germans. And they're the biggest nationality group yet today. We get about 4 million from Poland, 4 million from Italy. So go watch The Godfather and some of their struggles that they had. We have about 2 million Jews. 1/3 of the Eastern European Jewish population empties out, comes to America with all this development and hothouse growth. About 1 million Quebecians, that's surprising, from Canada. 1 million British or so. So just a lot of groups. And yet, they are torn off their farms, they're desperate. It's not like they come here, there's no social security net, there's no welfare, there's no social security, there's no minimum wage, none of that. They pretty much have to take what they can get, and it may be that Stanislaus from Poland is going to find himself working in hell. Exactly. Well, imagine working, amidst that kind of noise and heat, all day, and also the danger of that kind of a situation. There are, of course, a lot of toxic side effects. Women who work in textile factories, and they don't have really good lighting yet. They haven't worked out the kinks. And it's not necessarily that you'll go blind working over these machines, but it may be that when you get out at night, you have night blindness. There's ammonium, benzene, cyanide, all these kind of chemicals that are associated with a lot of this manufacture that's being left in the dirt and people are getting access to. That's really kind of toxic. There's just the drain, of course, of work. The kind of squeeze play that you have workers that may have their wages cut. There's no minimum wage at this time. And you could have rents going up. A famous case of the Pullman strike in Chicago in the 1890s, when a manufacturer owned a part of the city and was housing his workers, seemed to be generously, but he was raising their rents and he was cutting their wages. How do you live with that kind of stress and anxiety? But also to the existential questions. And that is, what is it like to, maybe some of you already know this, what is it like to work so long at something you really don't like doing? It's only in the late 19th century that we start getting atheism as a major idea. We've got these man-made environments, people feel totally estranged from God. And as Jean-Paul Sartre, the existentialist atheist philosopher, said that man becomes a useless passion, compelled to live and condemned to die, where everything is so inconsequential and so unnecessary, and yet it is so real, and you have to confront it. Things could get very isolating. Lots of times if you've got friends to help you, friends that carry you through, that's kind of nice. But in some factories, like say the Ford Motor Company, you could not talk to other people all during the day. It was wrong. They had what was called the Ford freeze on talking. So later on, many women, like in the feminist movement, will say, women just deal with children all day. They're losing their adult frame of reference. And farmers sometimes lose their frame of reference just talking to corn all day, or cowboys talk to animals. But what if you're just working with things all day? Nondescript gaskets and double-throw crankshafts for ocean liners. You don't even know what these things are. Good morning, thing. How are you doing? Before this, if you were in a shop, before this late phase of industrialization, you might be in a shop. You also help market your goods. When someone walked in the shop, you helped them out. You might be just an apprentice. You still do that. No more with this intense specialization, with this intense factory labor. Maybe does anyone work for Preference? Preference can kind of sometimes get into this kind of rough parallel, or Pilgrims, of course. Pilgrims is a very good example. Some of them would be very much like this. After the generation that really suffered for this in the late 19th century, there was one child of this woman, Charlie Chaplin, from a broken home, who kind of remembered it and became a very famous film producer and actor later on. And he kind of turns it into kind of laughter. But you can kind of see the real pain and hurt that lies beneath this Charlie Chaplin production. Let's see.
Get back to work.
Another one here, I hope I can get this one right here. Where they're trying to industrialize eating and lunchtime experience. And there was a name for this called Taylorism. Trying to make everything more efficient so workers can get more of an output. So they're trying to out here and try to Chaplin. Well, maybe you're not faced with an eating machine, but still you've got long hours, and some of you maybe know something about this kind of life. What are some of the responses that American workers would have? What kind of response would you have about working 12 hours a day, 6 days a week? Underpaid, certainly a very widespread response among many people that really aren't affiliated with churches or labor unions or anything is just to take it, you know. Maybe even become proud of your work and how much, you know, sweat you put into your life. My grandfather was like that. He'd work in a steel plant, and he could empty his boots out with water at the end. And he kind of turned to alcohol, and well, it was maybe one way of coping. There's also, of course, a large-scale Christian response to this. Our textbook gives 2 measly paragraphs to the social gospel, which really had very little influence among the working class in the late 19th century. But if you look at, say, Roman Catholics, or Lutherans, or Presbyterians, or Episcopals, or Baptists, Methodists, everyone is going up very steadily with the population, unlike today. Today there are drop-offs, or we're just kind of steady in our time of prosperity. But then, when they're experiencing all these gripping challenges, people are turning to the idea of 1 John 5 that Satan's in control, that you live in hope of the resurrection, you study the Bible. Certainly, another way is just getting extremely upset. Workers on the B&O Railroad in Baltimore and Ohio in 1877 had their wages cut 11 times, and finally they just broke out in a railroad war. We're not going to take this anymore. They got together, started throwing over locomotives and burning down roundhouses. Was that a good way to respond, incidentally? Just kind of, you didn't really prepare anything. It's not like you got a union together or anything like that. I just got really upset! And at that moment, I just took off and did something radical and angry. Was that a good way for, it was said that this strike of 1877, called the Railroad War, was started by wildcatters. It was kind of spontaneous, not people that were organized in a union. Was that a good way? Did that turn out to be a good way to respond? Just show your anger. Your boss crosses you, just tell him off. Ever try that? It doesn't really work too well, really, even today with workers. What happened in the 1877 situation is that they began blacklisting people. So that is, they would spread a list, if Andrew badmouthed the employer, well, Andrew Yox is not going to get hired anywhere. They also did a bunch of scamming on the 1877 boomers, the workers, as they were called, the railroad workers. Does anyone know, what does it mean to scam? 30 years ago in Lone Star, near us, there were people killed for scamming. There's big strikes at Lone Star Steel, which at one time was one of the greatest steel complexes in America. Lone Star was a great steel corporation. And one of its vice presidents from Dangerfield, Marvin Watson, was a personal secretary to Lyndon Johnson, the president. But in any case, scabbing is when you have workers crossing a picket line of a strike. So when a scab would do that, you would get shot. But of course, in the 19th century, you might import a lot of other immigrants. And you might have a whole group scab at once. Then it's kind of hard to keep them away from the picket line. So the employers might hire a bunch of Poles in a firm that's run by Germans and tell the Poles, hey, those people over there are Mädchen, which is the name for girl in German. So they would start calling it Mädchen, and you could get one group against the other, especially if they were really ignorant Poles that didn't know German. A lot of Poles did. In any case, there's yellow dog contracts. Anyone know what that is? Where you're forced to sign that you will not join a union. Since the 1930s, you cannot do this. But back then you could. And in fact, Brookshire's, the grocery store, was recently taken to court because they had this film, a video that new employees would see that kind of said, you know, we people that work at Brookshire, we're all one family. We don't have unions. But you can't really say that. So, so there are a lot of things that could really be a scourge of anyone, you know, just taken up and become really angry back then. Just in terms of general options, there's of course a more transcendent option that maybe you can work your way out of the working class. And when I say that there's a defeat of the working class in the 19th century, it's not because all the people associated with the working class were defeated. Some of them were able to rise above their $1-a-day jobs, another day another dollar, or even their $3-a-day jobs at the top end of this blue-collar pyramid, to say $4-a-day jobs or $5-a-day jobs in white-collar class or as barbers or working in a restaurant or something like that. But there's also the possibility of actually forming a more moderate American-type movement or real radical ideas that circulated that you would just destroy the whole establishment, destroy the whole society in the way it's organized. So there's a great diversity of responses to this unprecedented situation of working 6 days a week, 12 hours a day, and yet the very diversity weakens working class tremendously. So the rise of the Christian churches in a lot of these areas, they're not going to necessarily abide with the need for a union. And one of the most popular unions of the 1880s, Terence Powderly, basically gets on his hands and knees to plead with the Pope. He goes to Rome, please let Catholics into our union. Because the Catholics at first are a little suspicious of this holy, noble order of the Knights of Labor that wants to take in Catholics into their order. So the cards are really stacked against working class in a lot of ways, and one of the most dramatic illustrations of that, and how easily divided they are, was the formation of the Pinkertons. This is before the FBI. This is a great company based in Chicago that sends out detectives by the hundreds. So say you do have a union, and say you do have a strike, and say you do have a picket line, wonder if the corporation calls them the Pinkertons, and they guard the factory, and they allow another immigrant group in. You can't do anything about it. This is why one financier from New York, Jay Gould, maybe he was the Donald Trump of the 19th century, Jay Gould was the same one who said he would bury Lieutenant Jefferson in the railroad for one time. But Jay Gould one time said, hey, I could hire one half of the working class to kill the other half of the working class. Because he could hire Pinkertons. These are people that are getting maybe $2 a day for being, security guards, detectives, and this is where we get the private eye. So the Pinkertons were a dramatic illustration of the kind of ineptness of the working class, the difficulties they had. Perhaps another good symbol of that is Horatio Alger, the author, the writer, whose books were very popular in the late 19th century, and who basically didn't talk about how to deal with working class anger. He just talked about leaving the working class. And there's many stories about Dick the Luggage Boy or Ragged Rick or various figures that he invented and who he based on life stories of orphans he took in his home. Horatio Alger would always talk about how the hero maybe would save the boss's daughter from being drummed over by a carriage, and therefore he would, ascend to the higher levels, and he would get out of the working class. So the Horatio Alger stories were part of an American idealistic response to all this, that, hey, you won't have to be here in the blue-collar class. And about 50% actually do find a way out. A lot of them are buckwheats, so they're American, they can speak English. They know somebody in their Presbyterian church that might give them a better job. So mainly it's like foreign-speaking workers are obviously at a disadvantage. Any comments or questions so far? So beyond that, there are basically two labor unions that are more mainstream American. That is, they like the ballot booth and they like American traditions, but they hate each other. And this is another reason why we talked about the endemic divisiveness of labor at this time. And I'll pass these around. One is called the Knights of Labor, and the other is called the American Federation of Labor. Now, which is the more European group? Is it the Knights of Labor, or is it the American Federation of Labor? This is kind of a trick question. What has more buckwheats in it? The Knights of Labor or the American Federation of Labor? Trick question, because you would think the Knights would be like European, right? And the American would be buckwheat, but it's just the opposite. Just the opposite. The Americans are the Knights of Labor, and the Europeans are the American Federation of Labor. The Knights are started by Uriah Stephens, a buckwheat in Philadelphia in 1869. It passes on to Irish, Terence Powderly, but basically you have old stock Irish, German, English, American type of people, usually in the Knights. And the Knights, that idea of knighthood, should have learned from the idea that their idea was to raise up the prestige of the working man. The Knights of Labor come from the standpoint of old Jeffersonian America, where every man was his own king. Every man made his own economic decisions. If Terence Powderly were here today, and he talked with Carrie and Martine about what they do, and he talked with me, he would say, why have you lost your freedom? Why have you Americans lost your freedom? What's he talking about? Why have we Americans lost our freedom? Because he's coming from the standpoint where every American was pretty much a farmer, back there around 1800. They made their own decisions every hour of the day. Economic decision was real American economic freedom. Political freedom is only that thick. It's like when you go to the polling booth or something like that. But economic freedom is huge. And you go from a system where people are making their own decisions to it's, hey, you, do this. And that's what Terence Powderly and the Americans of the Knights, who want to raise themselves up, becoming like, aristocrats. That's what they're trying to counteract. Now, how did they try to counteract it? They tried to counteract it through cooperatives. So you think of the Knights, think of co-op. A bunch of knights together, co-op. And does anyone know what is a cooperative? Many farmers, too, are going to talk about cooperatives. It was a popular response to high industrialization of the late 19th century. What do I mean by co-op? If I said, Martine and Norma and me are going to form a co-op, and we're going to work really hard because it's going to be our own company. We're going to compete out there against preferreds. We're going to make our own farm equipment, and we'll take in Richard as well. Why might that, that might bring back the Jeffersonian idea, because everyone would be kind of like their own boss. Because we would have this cooperative, not a corporation. So, Terence Powderly, the guy who got down on his hands and knees and bringing the Roman Catholics and the Knights, which was the most popular labor union through the 1880s, Terence Powderly is talking about old-fashioned American freedom of the Knights. For the land of the free and the home of the... Shut up! We don't want to listen to those pipe dreams. And who's this? This is the leader of the American Federation of Labor, and he's Jewish. He's an immigrant. Samuel Gompers, the cigar maker from London. Sam Gompers thinks that this whole idea about turning everyone into their own decision makers is stupid. Sam Gompers, even though they have the American Federation of Labor as their name, are a bunch of immigrants. They're like ex-peasants. They're used to taking orders. And basically, what we want is more bread and more butter. Better working hours, better working conditions. We want a bigger piece of the pie. One time, Gompers, who was kind of a no-mo man, was questioned by a Senate subcommittee. about how many children he had. And he said, 11 or 12. Which seems to indicate that though he did not get in too much time with his children, working as a labor union boss and a worker, he did get in a few times with his wife at least. But he basically was able to organize as a cigar maker because cigar makers had a silent trade because you made cigars. So they would have boys read to them. And that's how he learned about the scene. He had people, he would hire a boy to read to them while they worked over these silent cigars. And he becomes leader of the Cigar Makers Union in New York, goes on to become the leader of the American Federation of Labor, which is concerned not about pie in the sky, let's go back to Jefferson, but let's just take what we have. Let's accept the fact that we are underlings, we're foreign language speakers, but let's get a bigger piece of the pie. The Knights of Labor, they're saying, every man a king. We don't want to strike because we want to work hard ourselves and raise ourselves up with singing societies and with literary clubs. But Gompers, he definitely wants to strike. Because get better bread and butter. Gompers is unfazed that Americans might be losing their freedom, their economic freedom. They had already been taking orders anyway in Europe. I was kind of interested when I went to El Paso. There was this Mexican-American artist, Luis Jimenez, who did this barfly Statue of Liberty. They have a museum there. And it kind of suggests the idea that Americans have traded the real occupational liberty that they once had for a kind of sexual liberty. So next time we'll be talking about the Victorian times and how strict we were, and how it was a super age of morality. But people were still trying to hang on with the Knights to this idea of having their own freedom economically. And in a sense, we've traded the economic freedom. We don't have that anymore, but maybe we have sexual freedom. Barfly Statue of Liberty. Of course, the real Statue of Liberty is also going up at this time, 1886, bringing in the European immigrants, a gift from the country of France. Any questions between the American Federation of Labor, the immigrants, led by Sam Gompers, the Knights of Labor, or old-time American buckweights, led by Terence Powderly? Two big, important American responses, because it involved articulating ideas, getting people involved in an organization. Of course, the two groups hate one another and are battling each other. And when the FFL has a strike, Powderly will send in his own people as scabs to try to break it, because each one sees the other vision as terrible. The FFL says, hey, we don't care about freedom, we want more hours and wages. And the FFL, of course, has just skilled workers in the union. So they built up a huge war chest. They're ready for a strike. They've got European connections. The Knights of Labor let everybody into the union except for bloodsuckers like the lawyers and prostitutes. But they can't really hold on a strike anyway. They don't have a big enough war chest. They're way more democratic, but this isn't necessarily a good time to be democratic, as we're going to see. Okay, so these two guys are fighting off against one another, the FFL and the Knights of Labor. And while all this is going on, there is also more radical groups coming in from Europe that want some bloodshed, want to start disobeying the laws. Things have gotten this bad. At first, there is what's called Christian socialism, or a benign form of this, in Europe, led by a guy whose name is Christian, or at least Wilhelm Christian Whiteling. Whiteling was kind of like a humble shoemaker who just became a spokesman for a lot of workers in Europe, and comes over to America briefly in the 1860s, and he says, that we should have a brotherhood, and that we should work together for democratic change, and that we should outvote these leaders of the capitalist order, those who want it. So there could be kind of like this peaceful change. Well, he's soon opposed by one of the real founding prophets of modern atheism, Karl Marx, a great writer who was kind of a rebellious Jewish German kid who, facing starvation, working for the working class, developed a great friendship with Friedrich Engels. Engels and Philip. my fellow radical German worker leader got money off his father's business, the textile firm in England, and siphoned it to Karl Marx. So Marx could work 12 hours a day in a library. So Marx is seen as the father of modern communism and modern socialism, modern Marxism, the red flag. And he spent a lot of time in the library working out these theories. And basically, Marxist theory is that all things that matter are hard. There's no God. All human history is a fight over these hard things. In the first stage, the aristocrats and the king's wife. In the second stage, the owners of the factories, the high middle class capitalists of John Rockefeller, Morgan. But in the last phase, the working class, being huddled together in these cities, are going to awaken to a consciousness. They're going to avoid all middle class morality, which is keeping them down, like love your neighbor. What's that? They're going to have a bloody revolution, and they're going to tear down the society and put workers ahead. It's a kind of a dictatorship of the proletariat, of the working class, as he calls it. And one time, Karl Marx meets Weitling at a Belgian saloon in Europe, when both movements are kind of